What I'd like to do now is just talk very generally about how you might come up with some ideas for your informative speech. Because, I mean, your informative speech needs ideas. That's what it's about. That's what you're conveying to us. This new thing that we may not be familiar with, or an old thing that we may have misapprehensions about. So you're clarifying this issue for us, but it needs ideas. Now, in your informative speech, these ideas might be claims as they were in the impromptu, or they might just be sort of general areas that you need to talk through. But you have to figure out what this is. Now, in some cases, you don't need to sort of ruminate on invention. The ideas just pop in your head. Let's say you wanted to speak on the Mars rover, and immediately you go, I know what I want to talk about. I want to talk about how we built the Mars rover, how we got the Mars rover to Mars, and the data that's coming back from the Mars rover about Mars. Maybe you know those are the three big things I want to talk about. In which case, great. But in many other cases, you need to think a little bit more, prime that mental pump to figure out what exactly you need to talk through. And so I kind of want to go back to that Aristotelian definition, one of the Aristotelian definitions of rhetoric, which is an ability in each case to see the available means of persuasion. So in that definition, it's about being able to see all possible routes, or at least many of the possible routes that you might pursue in designing a speech. And I think that's very useful, even if, when you're talking about the Mars rover, you immediately know what you want to speak on. You still should probably spend some time thinking about other possibilities, because the goal would be to be able to generate more content than you could use so that you can then judge. Because again, the informative speech is about you making an assessment in terms of what's going to be good for the speech. Does the topic require a discussion of this point? Does the audience require a discussion of this point? You want to have more options out there so you can render judgment and design the best possible speech. So invention is very useful, even if you think you know what you're going to speak on, because odds are that'll probably change over time. So there are a lot of ways to study invention. And in this video, what we're going to do is I'm going to talk sort of about the very broad lines of argument or lines of speech. Just some questions that you might ask yourself to come up with ideas for the informative speech. In the next video, we're actually going to go ahead and look at arrangement a little bit and see how can arrangement give us some ideas about what we might want to include. So in this video, I want to kind of talk about some very general prompts, some of them from antiquity. Then I want to talk a little bit about audience prompts and how the audience can help us figure out what needs to be addressed. And then I just kind of want to conclude by talking about some ideas for your informative speech assignment in this class. Now that said, even if you never do post a video for this class, all that I'm talking about should be applicable to informative presentations that you give outside this class. And I'm going to come back to this a couple of times, and that is, even if you're not working up a speech for this class, I really think that you should be mapping something out, thinking about the next type of informative presentation you need to give, and using this class as a workspace. Using that next assignment as a way of sharpening your understanding of this material. Because these videos are great as sort of general pieces of advice, but speech is a skill, and you need to refine that skill through practice. And so being able to work up informative presentations, that's what's going to get you better at it. So I would strongly urge you to actually start putting together a number of informative presentations, even if you don't do them for class. So like I said, I'd like to start with some just sort of broad, general, inventional topics. From the Greek tradition, we would call these topoi. Aristotle wrote a lot about topoi and possible realms for coming up with ideas. In the Roman tradition, we'd probably call these loci, common places where we can figure out what we might want to argue or what we might want to talk about. But they remain very general, useful, inventional guides. And in fact, we actually talked about some in the impromptu. I didn't tell you that. I'm devious that way, but I'm saying it now. But so we talked about these in that impromptu speech. So one of them would be division. Okay, what are the key components of your speech? So that Mars rover example I gave would probably be just thinking through what are the key parts of the topic. So that's sort of almost the life cycle of the Mars rover, where it came from, how it got there, what it's giving us back. Also, division just is a way of thinking through where I want to cleave where the break is, and thinking in terms of how do I break this into its constituent parts. Another one that we get out of the classical tradition is definition. And that's a very useful way of figuring out what you need to speak on, especially useful in an informative speech, where maybe that audience doesn't know the key terminology. So trying to figure out what are the key definitions that they need to understand. So a couple of years ago, I was working with someone on a speech. Here in Seattle, the city council was considering a ban on aggressive panhandling. And some people were for it, some people were against it. But I had someone who was trying to provide some information about it. And a lot of that speech came down to defining what aggressive panhandling meant, because it was not what most people thought it meant. And so that was a very specific legal definition, and that gave him a lot of information that was very useful for that audience to be able to speak through. But he got to that by thinking, what is the definition here? And I want to make sure everybody understands it. Certainly we can look to similarity or difference or comparison. So, a good example of this might be, how are modern democracies similar or different from, models of democracy from antiquity? So just thinking through all the ways in which they're similar or different, you start generating a number of potential points that you can then address, if it works for the speech. Now, in more modern versions, we can think of this, although actually there's an indication that we can get this partially from the classic tradition, but certainly in a more modern iteration, we talk about the 5 W's and an H. Who, what, when, why, where, and how. So those are just ways of approaching your topic and asking multiple questions of your topic to figure out what would somebody need to know. So again, here in Washington State, we recently legalized marijuana. Not just medicinal marijuana, we legalized pot. Us in Colorado, hooray us. And there's so many jokes, but I will pass on them now because we've only got so much time. So we just passed this marijuana legalization. So if you're trying to, as the police here in our state are, as well as the legislature is and the individual legislators are, trying to explain to the citizens of Washington, well, what does this mean? Well, this gives you a lot of potential areas for explaining that content. Who can possess marijuana? How much can they possess? What are the penalties for having too much? How are they going to do roadside sobriety checks when it comes to marijuana use? What are the penalties for selling to a minor? So all these, how are they going to process these? Where are they going to sell it? You could spend a lot of time throwing those 5 W's and an H at this topic and generate a ton of potential areas for discussion. Then you can sort through all those potential areas and say, for my topic, for my audience, these are really important, these less so. So you're able to render a critical judgment about inclusion and exclusion. A little bit about arrangement patterns. So those are sort of the topo. Arrangement patterns we'll take up primarily in the next lecture. But I'm not trying to put the cart before the horse there, but arrangement, thinking about how we might arrange it, can also kind of help us figure out what areas we haven't included enough of or too much of. But we'll pick up arrangement as an inventional resource in the next lecture. One of your chief inventional resources, especially in the informative speech, is your audience. Thinking through your speech from their perspective. What don't they currently understand? Your job is to inform that audience, so you should probably figure out what they don't understand at the moment and then remedy that. And think back to those communication goals. So in those goals, you were saying, here's what I want that audience to achieve. Look at those goals and say, well, what's preventing the audience from achieving that goal? Maybe that's the blockage. Maybe that's what you need to explain away so that they can better understand it. So you need to be thinking through what sort of misunderstandings does a novice with this material normally make. And so you're trying to think as much as possible from the perspective of a listener, okay? And a listener who doesn't know as much about the topic as you do. So what would some of their potential questions be? Depending on what the subject is, it would be, how does this work? What is an unexpected finding or a surprising thing about this topic that I wouldn't have known ahead of time? What's an example of this thing in practice? Because your job is to help that audience understand your topic. That's what you're doing as an informative speaker. So what's currently preventing them from understanding it? Is it a lack of information, or maybe it's an abundance of bad information? And your tactics would change based on whether or not you've got to provide information that they've never heard of, or you've got to counter bad information. You may think this is the case, but let me show you why it's not, and let me explain what is in fact the truth. So this is all these sort of generating ideas. These are very broad themes. Definition, that's pretty big. And at this level, we're just trying to throw some pretty big questions at your subject matter to help you generate all possible lines of argument, helping you figure out what are those possible means of persuasion, as Aristotle would have you do. Because we want to be in the realm of judgment. And knowing what you know as a semi-expert on this topic, what are the key points that need to be addressed for this topic and for your audience? So ideally, you would know your topic and your audience. Without a deep knowledge of your audience, you need to be in the position of making reasonable assumptions, or trying to figure out what they may or may not know. And actually, this is one of the benefits of a live performance, is you can read that audience, right? If you're speaking and they've got quizzical, faces, you probably know that you need to slow down and pause for questions, or sort of take the temperature of the room. And you can always stop and ask them if this is a point that you need to cover, or if not. So having a live audience allows you to engage in this type of judgment much more dynamically. Now, we don't have that in many cases, and we certainly don't have it in this class. So if you're trying to get a read on your audience for the assignment for this class, I think going to the discussion forums would be a good place. That's not everybody in the class, but that is a public space where we have our public discourse, so you can kind of see what's going on there and get a sense for who is in this class. But generally, I think you can assume that it is an educated audience. Certainly the survey data that we've seen coming back has indicated that, and they're interested in learning. So I think a general topic would work well, especially if my Southern came out there. I think we all heard that. I'm not going to re-record it. I'm going to embrace the whale. My grandma would be proud. But I think a general topic would work well. And in that topic, you'd be stating all the tools that we need for understanding. So like in that Cairo speech, I'm assuming no one knows what that is. And so I can bring them up to speed on that topic, but it's going to involve definitions, starting from sort of a point zero. You don't know what this term is. Here's how it's defined. Here's how it's operationalized. Here's an example of it. So I'm sort of bringing them along. And so I think that might work specifically for this type of platform where we don't have a live audience right there, and we may not know too much about the people on the other side of the screen. So that's some general threads of thought. We're going to pick up much more specific threads of thought, inventional prompts, in the next lecture, where we're looking at arrangement as a way of generating ideas.